This is Deborah Arca with the Pathos Book Club, and I have with me today Gary Tillery, who is the author of a book we're featuring at the book club this month called The Seeker King, a spiritual biography of Elvis Presley. And it's very timely as this is Elvis Presley's birthday week. He would have been, I believe, 79 years old.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, okay, I think I did the math right. So, Gary, you're an author of both fiction and nonfiction books, and you've written two other spiritual biographies of famous men, John Lennon and George Harrison, right?
That's correct.
Books have also been translated into German, French, and Portuguese, so have been very successful across the world. This book, The Seeker King, what got you interested in Elvis's spiritual life?
Well, he was, I did look around through a few, but different names, but when I ran across Elvis, I was surprised. I started digging into his spiritual background, expecting probably like most people that he was a Southern Christian, and there wasn't much of a story there. And the more I read, the more I realized that I was wrong. There was quite a bit there. He explored different avenues for most of his career. But the more I dug, the more I found.
Right. So that's kind of the interesting thing about this book, maybe, is that Elvis's spirituality is perhaps the lesser known about him as an icon. And so tell us a little bit about what was at the heart of his spiritual quest, and what do you think will most surprise readers about Elvis's spiritual journey?
The range, I suppose, of it. In 1964, he was having kind of a spiritual crisis. He'd always felt since he became famous in '56 that he had a special mission that God had selected for him, because no one had really been as famous as Elvis in the music field before him, and he couldn't understand how all of a sudden he became Elvis, quotes. And he thought there was something special going on. And then in April of '64, he met a man named Larry Geller. Larry Geller was actually his hairstylist, but Geller had been in his own spiritual search for a few years and had read a lot of different books and meditated and joined the Swami Yogananda's bunch there in Los Angeles. So he started talking to Elvis about this, and Elvis just leaped into it. He was just delighted to have this change. And he started seeing this as his answer.
I think that's interesting. Most people would probably assume that Elvis was a good old Christian boy. He obviously grew up in the South and has deep roots in Southern Baptist Christianity. What do you think was missing in his Christian spiritual life that he found so compelling in the works that Geller was introducing him to?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily put it as missing. He was always a Bible reader. He was always a dedicated Christian. So nothing like that changed. Even after he got into the things that we were talking about, he continued to believe that. There was another dimension to it that he found, that he started exploring.
Before he met Geller, one of Elvis's earliest girlfriends gave him a copy of Khalil Gibran's The Prophet, which ended up becoming one of his most favorite and treasured books, and one he came back to again and again in his life. What was it about that book, do you think, that captured Elvis's attention at that time?
Well, at first it was just probably the language. Gibran was a very good word stylist, and the way things are phrased in that book are very inspiring. They're very poetically said. And then it just so happened that about a little bit later than that, Elvis's mother died. And so that became one of his big resources. I think he relied on it then, and it came at a time when he was thinking about what happened to his mother, and did she continue to live, and what's it like. So he was interested in reincarnation, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and so as you mentioned, at the height of his career, he met and befriended this hairstylist, Larry Geller, who then became a really spiritual mentor for much of his life. And Geller introduced him to a new book that would become his kind of new favorite book that was called The Impersonal Life by Joseph Benner, which Elvis in turn bought hundreds of and gave to all of his friends. He was so compelled by it. Tell us a little bit about that book and why you think that book struck such a chord with Elvis at that particular moment in his career.
It was just a very resonant approach to spirituality in that book. Benner actually published it anonymously because he wanted the person to read it as though it weren't from another author. So the whole thing is composed and presented as not an author speaking to you through words, but God speaking to you through yourself while you're reading it. So it was this approach, I think, that really grabbed Elvis.
So, what were his friends and his family thinking about this kind of newfound spiritual quest of Elvis's?
Well, it was almost universal rejection, actually. Everybody was content with the way things are going with their lives and being Elvis's friend and employer, or employees, and this kind of thing. No one really got into his into the same spirit of it that he did, with the exception of a few people he met along the way.
So it's sad in a way that he had this one friend Geller, but he really felt really alone in his spiritual search, and it's really kind of exacerbated by the fact that he is isolated because of his fame. So he's isolated with the small group of people, none of whom are really sharing this spiritual quest. So it must have just been increasingly frustrating and for him to pursue this, but yet he really still did.
Well, that's very well put. He was in this little cocoon. He couldn't really go out and mingle with a lot of new people except for the people in the movies that he was on. And so he was insulated from the world by this group, and the people in the group did not share his enthusiasm. So yes, it was very isolating for him.
What effect did some of these books and spiritual practices and so forth have on him, the way he lived, the way he treated people?
He started being very generous. He was always a generous guy. There's some stories about him as a kid that were very interesting. But he started just being very magnanimous in a special way. He was no longer interested in, well, I shouldn't say he wasn't interested in the trappings of life, because he enjoyed, being able to buy whatever he wanted. But he also gave it away. I mean, if he saw the need for somebody, there's a story of a black woman in Memphis who had no legs, and this was published in the newspaper in Memphis, and she couldn't afford any help, and so she rolled around town on a skateboard, I think it was. And he saw the story, and he, without being asked or contacted her, ordered the best electric wheelchair in the country and personally delivered it to her house so she could have it. He did this kind of thing all the time. He was a very generous guy. And he saw it as part of his own, spirituality and his gratefulness to God for what he had received.
Yeah. There's this. He talks about feeling singled out by God for a special purpose. There's a lot of stories related to him that you share in the book that I found really interesting. That he did have some kind of special powers, as reported by other people. I mean, there's one story where he lifted up his hand and the rain stopped, and another story where he just some kind of healing that he did, laying hands on people. So tell me a little bit about what you learned about that.
Well, it actually accentuated his own search in that area when he met Geller. But faith healing was a part of the Assembly of God Church. So he had already done some of that. He practiced faith healing himself. With Priscilla, for example, she said he could cure her headaches immediately just by laying on his hands. There was a story of one of his Memphis Mafia, Jerry Schilling, who had been racked up by a motorcycle accident. For 2 weeks, he was in really acute pain in a hospital. Elvis walked in, and after 30 minutes of waving his hands above Jerry's back, he was almost 100% cured, not quite. but he said he was really impressed by it. So Elvis was already doing this anyway. When he got into the meditation, the self-realization fellowship in '65, he started training himself to do more, and he claimed he could do telekinesis and this kind of thing. He was again exploring.
Did any of the different traditions or paths stick with him more than others, or did he ultimately kind of come back to Christianity? I mean, he really never left Christianity. He just was expanding his sense of what Christianity was. But, did any of the, he did yoga, he did numerology, he did a lot of esoteric kind of explorations. Did any of them stick with him more than others?
That's a good question. I hadn't thought of it that way. He more or less integrated these things into a bigger picture is what he did. I mean, he didn't lose anything or give up anything, but he expanded his boundaries to incorporate new things.
What surprised you the most in doing this research for this book?
His epiphany that he had in 1965, he was driving in northern Arizona. He was returning to Hollywood from Memphis for another movie, and he was riding in his motorhome, and he was riding with Larry Geller up front, and all of a sudden Geller heard him say, "Whoa!" And Geller looked over, and Elvis was looking ahead, and so Geller did, and Elvis said, "Did you see that?" And it was unmistakable. There was only one cloud in the sky, and it was exactly in the shape of Joseph Stalin's face.
Joseph Stalin's face.
So he was taken by this, and all of a sudden Elvis pulled the bus over, the motorhome over, to the side of the road, ran out the door, and called for Geller to follow him. And as Geller did into the desert, apparently Elvis was having this ecstatic experience. He was talking about love and God, and that he finally understood. And the more he talked about it, he wasn't very articulate at the time, but he had a very powerful personal religious experience at that time. And he was asking God, "Why Stalin? Am I like that? If I am, take me now, because I don't want to be." And at that point, the cloud changed to represent Jesus. It mutated into the face of Jesus, according to Elvis. Geller didn't see that. And this had a powerful experience in Elvis for several years. And it wasn't until much later in his career, through some ups and downs, that he finally admitted to Geller that he actually thought he was Jesus. That was his experience. He thought, "I'm here as the new Messiah." And this scared the hell out of him. It was really a powerful experience. And of course, later on, he had more time to muse about what it all meant, and then he realized that it wasn't that he was Jesus, it was that he had been selected for this mission to uplift people, which he did through his entertainment.
Well, it's a really interesting story. I learned a lot about Elvis Presley, the rock star and the man and the spiritual seeker from this book. And there's a lot of really interesting and fun and curious stories in here. I think Elvis may still be with us now. He's been in this interview all along. You can tell we've been having sound problems. So I'm going to attribute that to Elvis Presley, perhaps being present with us in this interview. Maybe he didn't want us to have it. I don't know. But anyway, it's a lovely, generous book about this man and his spiritual search. Gary Tillery, thank you for being with us today. Check out the Pathos Book Club for more. You can read an excerpt, and we'll be having bloggers read the book and blog about the book and what they learned here and throughout this month. So thanks, Gary, for your patience today.
Thank you, Deborah. I appreciate this.
All right. Bye-bye.